Zambia is calling on the African Union and the Southern African Development Community to intervene in its diplomatic dispute with Zimbabwe following recent remarks by President Emmerson Mnangagwa. Mnangagwa allegedly told Russian President Vladimir Putin that the US has been supplying weapons to Zambia to consolidate power in the region and isolate Zimbabwe. For more on this, we are joined by international relations analyst Professor Gilbert Khadiagala. Professor, very good afternoon. Appreciate your time. So let's start off with those allegations that are supposed to have been made by Zimbabwean President Emmerson Mnangagwa. Just how much truth is there to it?
You know, it's very difficult to verify whether these accusations are correct or not, because they came from Mr. Mnangagwa, the president of Zimbabwe. But my hunch is that because Zambia has been having very good relations with the US, both economically and militarily, under Mr. Hichilema, the new president of Zambia, really not the new, but he's been around now almost 3 years. But Zimbabwe, I think, feels that as Mr. Mnangagwa told Putin, that he feels lonely that the West has abandoned Zimbabwe. But I think the truth of the matter is that there is growing relations between the US and Zambia, but whether that is amounting to what is being described as militarization, I don't really think so.
So your suspicion is that there is absolutely no intelligence that's been involved in establishing this issue that then President Mnangagwa has gone to say? It's just based on a whim?
No, I think Zimbabwe, Mnangagwa went to Russia to seek aid from Russia. And he put it very clearly, he needs military, economic, and food assistance from Putin. I think that is the main point here. But I suspect that the argument about the US militarizing Zambia, I think, is being exaggerated. But it also has to be put in the context of not very amicable relations between Zambia and Zimbabwe since Mr. Hichilema came to power. So it's a Cold War that has been existing because of the perception that Mr. Hichilema is closer to Zimbabwean opposition. So I think it's a larger problem of just the deterioration of this relationship. But I think the embarrassing point of it is a whole president having to put it to Russia that we are really feeling very lonely of having been abandoned by the West. To me, it just looks like an exaggerated claim here to get aid from the Russians.
So just, well, I suppose you talk about it being an exaggerated claim. So, you know, I mean, there's very little information to go on from what you're saying to suggest that the accusations that are being made are indeed true. But obviously it's irked the Zambians, because the Zambians have now said they've appealed to the AU, to SADC to resolve this issue. So it's obviously impacting regional dynamics within the Southern African community.
Yeah, I think, you know, Zambians feel that the situation cannot deteriorate any further. And these institutions, the SADC and the African Union, were created really to mediate conflicts among member countries. And if they can't do that job, then in fact we are doubting their ability to be really credible institutions, because something like this should not deteriorate. Or these are, if there are clear claims that need to be verified by these institutions when they do the investigations, then we can get the truth. Because Zimbabwe, if the conflict is mediated, then Zimbabwe will have to produce the evidence that in fact Zambia is being used by the US to destabilize Zimbabwe. But my suspicion at this moment is that since we don't have any clear evidence, it is very difficult to accept the fact that Zambia, which has had very good relations with Zimbabwe since pre-independence period, would then, in fact, get this worse. So I think the Zambians are just interested in a party or an institution that can come between them and try to see where the truth lies.
Now, Professor Khadiagala, I'd imagine that there's certain protocols that should be followed or observed when something of this nature arises before you get to SADC and before you get to the AU. There's normally a summoning of various diplomats within the confines of one's own borders. So I'd imagine that the Zimbabwean ambassador to Lusaka would have been called before this issue was taken to SADC or the AU.
Let me put it this way. I think there are many diplomatic channels that Zimbabwe should have used in raising that issue before it went to Putin. I think this is a problem here. It has escalated to Putin, and I think that's why Zambia feels that it is getting worse. Because if a whole president can report Zambia for being the destabilizer in the region currently, I think it was the wrong move probably, because there are other channels that needed to be exhausted. And you're right, even before we go to SADC and the AU, I think it would probably have made sense for the two countries to resolve this conflict amicably. Maybe talk about it, find means of resolving it. But I think now it's gone too far that the Zambians may feel that the only mediator would be a SADC or an AU kind of institution, because these countries are members of these institutions and they are supposed to respect the mediation roles of these institutions. I think that's why they feel that they needed to go that route, because now the train has already left the station. The relationship are worsening.
Professor Khadiagala, you make an interesting point, obviously, and that's the fact that the complaint, if you will, was made at a global stage, so almost overriding any internal resolution mechanisms that could be followed by the two countries. Now, how can the SADC and AU strike a balance between respecting national sovereignty and addressing concerns raised by member states?
I think the AU or SADC, starting with SADC, they need to have a discussion between the two presidents, probably not together but separately, and try to really find out whether there is a room for a mediated solution. But I'm saying that even a mediated solution hinges on the kinds of evidence that Zimbabwe will have to bring to the table. Because if you make the claim that this country, your neighbor, is being militarized, then you have to come up with the figures and the numbers to put to SADC heads of state, who can then, in fact, make a decision on how to resolve this issue. But I suspect this is probably a conflict that is much bigger than, I think, the AU or even SADC. Because as I said from the outset, it was presented to Putin as a matter of fact. And so these countries seem, or rather Zimbabwe seemed convinced that in fact Zambia is a threat to its security. So I think it's not too late to ask SADC, as I said, because the two countries are members of SADC or the AU. These institutions can still step in and try to see whether they can find a way out of the conflict.
So let's talk about the mechanisms that exist to prevent such disputes from escalating.
No, the first mechanism I would imagine is bilateral relationships. There are bilateral agreements where they talk about good neighborliness, respect for each other, sovereignty, and so on. And then when you go to the AU, to the SADC level, there are also these kinds of mechanisms that are there that speak about the same issues, how we build brotherly relationships and all that, resolving conflicts through mutual mechanisms. So the mechanisms are there. They are commonsensical mechanisms in which simply saying, as states, we have to live together in peace because we belong to the same institutions that have the objective of fostering economic integration and political unity at some point. So these institutions already are are engineered, in fact, to resolve conflict routinely. And I think that's the surprising thing about Zimbabwe taking this matter directly to Russia before exhausting these mechanisms.
Let's talk about precedents. Has something of this nature or similar happened within the SADC region? And if so, how was it attended to?
No, you see, the closest I can think of is the deterioration between Botswana and Zimbabwe relations over the years, I think. And under Mr. Robert Mugabe, those relationships were not very good because the then president of Botswana, Ian Khama, was very hard on Zimbabwe, particularly after the elections that happened then. But the way that conflict ended is that both parties simply decided that they needed to come together and resolve that conflict because it was a conflict about Botswana questioning the legitimacy of the elections in Zimbabwe. But over time, I think they came to the conclusion that it was not that important, that Mugabe was in power as an elected president. However, he was elected. Botswana could forget that issue. So I think it was resolved very quickly because there was political will on both sides. There are a lot of things that we share together, and we should not, in fact, be divided by something like this. So this is the closest, I think, that comes to what is happening currently, is that the two sides ultimately may have to reach a decision that there are too many things that unite the two countries, and therefore they need to move quickly to some kind of agreement.
Okay, so let's call it domestic politics, and I call it domestic politics because what obviously happens when issues like this emanate is that it spills onto the streets of Twitter or of social media, where the various citizens of each country start hurling insults and all sorts of accusations at each other. So there's almost a Cold War that's existing amongst the citizens of the two countries. How can this be managed, or is it something that you feel will just blow over?
You see, I think in the age of social media, this thing may blow over. I mean, the citizens may get incensed by the kind of war of words that are going on between their presidents. But I suspect that the two countries are mature enough really to resolve this conflict before it gets into Twitter and all these other media that are going to, in fact, escalate the tensions between the two countries. But, you know, when you talk about domestic politics, let me also mention some important component of this conflict. Last year, when Zimbabwe had elections, the SADC team was headed by the former vice president of Zambia. And when the SADC team came up with their report, they said very clearly that those elections did not meet regional international standards. And the Zimbabweans didn't like that. And in fact, SADC had to make a position, came up with a statement that said, you cannot rubbish SADC observer missions, despite the fact that, you know, the head of that mission was a former Zambian vice president. So that's part of the escalation of the conflict, I think, that started with the perception that Zambians actually against Zimbabwe, if they cannot, even within the framework of SADC, there was that feeling that, in fact, this is actually more of a Zambian position than a SADC position about those elections.
So, Professor, you suspect that Zimbabweans, or certainly President Emmerson Mnangagwa, might be feeling a little bit sore over that report from last August?
Yeah, no, he is, because I think members of the ruling party in Zimbabwe really came out very clearly in public to accuse SADC of that report. But again, I think they made insinuations that that report was too critical because the head of it was a Zambian. So I think that's part of the context of this conflict, that the Zambians leading a SADC delegation will reach a decision that that election was not free or fair. So that is the larger context in which this conflict is playing out. And as I also mentioned, the feeling that President Hichilema may have had very good relations with Mr. Nelson Chamisa, the opposition leader, even before he came to power in Zambia.